Multiple rounds of severe weather are about to unleash across the country, but the setup has genuinely shifted since we last talked about this pattern, and I think it's worth walking through exactly what changed. Over the next few days, we're going to see scattered thunderstorms fire off from the Central Plains all the way to the Great Lakes, bringing a threat for damaging winds, isolated large hail, and a couple of tornadoes. But the bigger story here is that the frontal boundary driving all of this is going to stall out completely as we move into early next week. And that's going to allow storms to repeatedly track over the same areas, which is exactly the setup that increases the threat for flash flooding across the upper Midwest and eventually the Ohio Valley. At the same time, that heat wave we've been tracking out west is going to keep building, before expanding eastward into the Central Plains later this week. This storm really has taken a big turn since our last update, so let's get right into the forecast, because there's a lot to unpack today. Let's jump straight into the severe weather potential for the next few days, and we'll start with today, which is Saturday. Right now, the Storm Prediction Center has a marginal risk of severe thunderstorms in place across portions of the northern and central plains, extending into the upper Mississippi Valley, with a couple of additional marginal risk areas covering parts of the mid-Atlantic and southern Arizona. Severe thunderstorms will be possible this afternoon and evening across the central and northern plains, stretching southeast into the lower and middle Missouri Valley. Additional strong to severe storms are possible over in the mid-Atlantic, and separately across central and southern Arizona as well, though that's a completely different setup tied to ongoing monsoon moisture, rather than the frontal system we're tracking across the middle of the country. Here's what's actually happening with today's setup specifically. We had a modest but weakening low-level jet earlier this morning across parts of Nebraska and South Dakota, and that supported some ongoing elevated convection, mainly focused over Nebraska. That activity is going to weaken and spread southeast through the morning hours, though it could still pose a marginal risk for hail as it does. As we move into the afternoon and evening, we've got broad northwesterly flow aloft that's going to modestly strengthen as several shortwave disturbances migrate through the base of an upper-level low sitting over central Canada. Now here's the catch with today specifically. Height falls in the atmosphere are expected to be fairly weak, and we've got warm mid-level temperatures in place that are going to pose some capping issues, meaning there's a layer of warm air aloft that can act almost like a lid, suppressing storms from fully developing even in an environment that otherwise looks supportive. That said, we do have surface troughing setting up across the northern and central high plains, and that's going to result in south to southeasterly low-level winds, which will transport dew points in the 60s northward across the Central Plains and the Missouri Valley, running ahead of a surface front that's going to be sagging southward across North Dakota and northern Minnesota later in the day. As that boundary layer moisture increases beneath fairly steep mid-level lapse rates, we should see moderate to strong destabilization develop, and several areas of convection could fire up during the late afternoon and evening near that surface trough, with additional activity possible overnight closer to where that front ends up settling. I'll be honest with you, given the weak large-scale ascent and those warm mid-level temperatures working against storm development today, there's genuine uncertainty about exactly where storm coverage is going to be greatest and how widespread today's activity actually ends up becoming. This is a day where the main concerns remain damaging wind gusts and some isolated large hail, and I'd call the tornado risk fairly low today, though not entirely off the table given the wind shear that will be in place if anything does manage to organize. Now here's where things genuinely get more interesting, because I think our threat of severe weather is going to gradually build as we move into Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. And this is really the part of the pattern that's taken a notable turn compared to what we were tracking just a day or two ago. Current medium-range guidance is showing an elongated zone of thunderstorm and damaging wind potential setting up from the northern plains across parts of the Midwest and Great Lakes. And this corridor could even extend into parts of the Northeast, depending on exactly how things evolve. I do want to flag directly that predictability is genuinely low with this specific pattern, and that's because of the likelihood of ongoing storm corridors firing up early each day, combined with real variability in exactly where that elongated, roughly west to east oriented front ends up settling day to day. However, we do have a very moist air mass in place, with potentially strong instability building to the south. And that's going to combine with waves of energy rotating around that large upper-level trough sitting over Canada, which together could produce storm corridors with a real damaging wind threat. Right now, the roughest areas of interest are the northern plains into the upper Midwest specifically on Sunday, and then portions of the Great Lakes and Midwest on Monday. It's worth pausing here to explain something important about how these medium-range outlooks work, because I don't want anyone walking away from this thinking a lack of a drawn risk area 3 or 4 days out means there's zero risk. Generally speaking, the Storm Prediction Center needs fairly high confidence before they'll draw a specific risk area this far into the future. So the absence of a more detailed outlook for Monday or Tuesday right now doesn't mean nothing's going to happen. It just means we're still working with lower confidence, broader scale guidance, rather than the more refined outlooks you'll see closer to the actual event. Let's go day by day now with the actual timing, because I think that's the most useful way to walk through exactly how this is going to unfold. Starting with today, I don't think we're looking at anything particularly unusual through the daylight hours. Across the northern and central plains, despite that broader risk area being in place, I don't expect much to happen before evening. Most of today's activity is likely going to develop after storms fire up along that sagging front later tonight, with the best chance for organized convection coming after dark as the low-level jet strengthens and taps into that richer Gulf moisture streaming northward. Across the mid-Atlantic today, we're watching for some locally gusty winds tied to a thunderstorm cluster currently sitting over West Virginia, along with a separate cluster over Connecticut, and thunderstorm activity may persist toward the mid-Atlantic into the evening hours, though overall severe potential should diminish after sunset as we lose daytime heating and the boundary layer starts stabilizing. As we head into Sunday, this is where I think the pattern really starts to show its teeth. Showers and thunderstorms are likely to continue through the morning and into the early afternoon across the upper Midwest, with isolated wind and isolated hail on the table. The exact placement of a boundary setting up during Sunday afternoon is going to be the single biggest factor determining how this severe threat actually unfolds, because depending on how far south that boundary ends up sitting, it could shift the more significant severe weather potential further south than current guidance suggests. What I am watching closely are our significant tornado parameter values, because they're forecast to climb notably through the afternoon and evening across parts of the upper Midwest, and by evening we could be looking at some of the higher values we've seen in a while in this specific region, layered on top of a genuinely large amount of atmospheric instability. The honest answer right now is that the biggest question mark for Sunday is exactly how storms are going to evolve once they get going. Specifically, whether we end up with more of a broken line of storms, which tends to limit the tornado threat while still producing widespread damaging wind, or whether one or two discrete supercells manage to stay isolated within that unstable air, in which case a strong or even significant tornado threat becomes a real possibility. Different forecast models are genuinely disagreeing on exactly how this plays out too, which is worth being upfront about. Some guidance has storms consolidating fairly quickly into an organized line, which would limit the more dangerous tornado potential, while still bringing a legitimate widespread wind threat to communities across the upper Midwest and into the western Great Lakes during the evening hours. Other models are keeping storms more discrete for longer, which would raise the ceiling on an isolated but potentially strong tornado threat somewhere within that corridor. There's also some spread in exactly how far north or south the most significant activity ends up setting up, with a difference of up to 100 miles or so between different model solutions on where the highest tornado threat parameters actually line up. That's exactly the kind of detail that makes this specific setup tricky to nail down this far out. And it's going to come down largely to what happens with storm development tonight and early tomorrow morning, so make sure you're checking back for updates because we'll have a fresh look at this as soon as we get more data in. Monday's forecast is even more dependent on exactly how Sunday plays out, so I want to be upfront that there's real uncertainty layered into everything I'm about to walk through. Current guidance has a line or cluster of thunderstorms tracking across Michigan and Lake Erie during the early morning hours on Monday, which should weaken out as it moves through, before a brand new round of thunderstorms develops during the afternoon further east, somewhere in the vicinity of the Ohio-Pennsylvania border. Depending on exactly where that new round of storms sets up, it's likely going to produce a fairly significant damaging wind threat, and there could be a few supercells mixed in that bring at least a low-end tornado risk to parts of that corridor as well. One of the details I want to flag specifically for Monday and Tuesday, though, is genuinely more important than the tornado question, and it's the flooding risk. Wherever these storms do end up setting up along that stalled front, they're very likely going to be training, meaning storm after storm moving over essentially the same stretch of ground, rather than spreading rainfall out across a wider area. That's exactly the setup that produces significant flash flooding, and current indications point toward that risk building specifically across areas like Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania, potentially continuing right on through Tuesday and Wednesday as this same general pattern keeps repeating across the Ohio Valley and Midwest. The Weather Prediction Center has already started flagging exactly this concern in their own excessive rainfall outlooks. There's a slight risk of excessive rainfall specifically covering the upper Midwest and upper Mississippi Valley for the period running from Sunday into Monday, and that risk area then shifts to cover northern Indiana specifically for the following stretch, running from Monday into Tuesday. The broader setup behind this is a wide area of cyclonic flow expected to persist across the northern tier of the country, running from the northern plains and upper Mississippi Valley eastward through the Midwest and Great Lakes and into the northeast, sitting just south of a closed low-pressure system parked over Hudson Bay. A frontal boundary is going to sit right along the southern edge of that broader trough, and as individual shortwave disturbances embed themselves within that flow, they're going to enhance lift right along that front, with precipitable water values, essentially a measure of how much moisture is available in the atmospheric column to be wrung out as rain, rising to around 1 3/4 inches hours ahead of each one of those disturbances. Combine repeated shortwaves riding along a stalled front with that much available moisture, and you get exactly the kind of setup that can produce genuinely serious localized rainfall totals, especially anywhere storms end up repeatedly tracking over the same towns in the same drainage basins. There is real model disagreement right now on exactly how extreme those rainfall totals could end up being, and I want to be honest about that uncertainty, rather than overstating a specific number this far out. Some guidance is hinting at the possibility of localized totals pushing well beyond a foot of rain in isolated spots if everything lines up exactly right, while other models are considerably more conservative and don't show nearly as dramatic a signal in that same area. That kind of spread between models is genuinely common with this kind of mesoscale, training thunderstorm setup, since it comes down to very fine details in exactly where storms repeatedly redevelop, something that's inherently difficult to pin down with precision several days in advance. But regardless of which specific model ends up verifying, the broader theme both models agree on is the same. Meaningful, potentially locally significant rainfall settling in across a stretch running from the upper Midwest, through the Great Lakes, and into the Ohio Valley as we move through Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. So if you live in that corridor, specifically northern Indiana, Ohio, southern Michigan, southern Wisconsin, or anywhere along the upper Mississippi Valley, and especially if you're in a low-lying area or have any travel plans running through that region over the next several days, it's genuinely worth staying weather aware, not just for the severe thunderstorm threat itself, but specifically for the flash flooding risk building on top of it. After Tuesday, the forecast genuinely becomes a lot more uncertain, and I want to be upfront about that rather than pretending we have a confident read on exactly what happens toward the middle of next week. There's a broader signal in the longer range guidance hinting at 1 or 2 additional shortwave troughs moving across the Great Plains and into the Midwest by Wednesday and Thursday, which could bring additional rounds of severe weather, but the confidence behind that signal is genuinely low at this point. It's also worth keeping in mind that we're heading toward the middle of August now, and widespread, headline-grabbing severe weather outbreaks become considerably less common this time of year compared to the more classic spring severe season. Activity tends to become more localized in nature going forward, similar to what we actually saw play out recently in northeast Iowa, where a couple of confirmed tornadoes touched down, alongside genuinely significant straight-line wind damage. But the overall footprint of that event stayed fairly contained, rather than spreading across a broad, multi-state corridor. That said, we are watching for the possibility of some kind of larger-scale synoptic feature, essentially a more organized low-pressure system, making its way across the Midwest sometime around the middle of August, which could bring a more numerous severe weather threat back into play. But for right now, the setup beyond Tuesday looks fairly spotty, and I don't foresee a major outbreak on the immediate horizon. I do want to be genuinely honest about just how unpredictable this specific stretch of severe weather is right now, because that's an important part of setting expectations correctly. Any one of the next several days could end up carrying a genuinely high ceiling. We could easily see a significant tornado threat materialize on Sunday or Monday. We could just as easily end up with a widespread wind event and comparatively little tornado activity. Or we could see this entire setup underperform relative to current guidance and end up with considerably less than what the models are currently suggesting. This kind of setup, driven heavily by smaller-scale mesoscale features rather than a large, well-organized synoptic system, is genuinely one of the harder patterns to forecast with precision. And realistically, we may not know exactly how significant any individual day within this stretch is going to be until the day actually arrives. That's exactly why I want you checking back for updates as we move through the weekend, because the picture is going to sharpen considerably as we get closer to each individual day. Let's touch briefly on the tropics, because that's a separate piece of this broader weather picture worth checking in on. Right now, I'm not seeing much in the way of organized tropical activity over at least the next 5 days or so. There are a couple of tropical waves worth keeping an eye on out in the eastern Atlantic that could cause problems further down the line, but most of the deterministic models are currently showing a considerable amount of wind shear working against development in that region, which tends to disrupt a young tropical system before it can organize into anything more serious. So for right now, the tropics remain fairly quiet, though that's exactly the kind of situation that can shift, potentially as soon as the middle of August, so it's worth keeping half an eye on that even while our attention stays mostly focused on this active pattern across the middle of the country. Now let's talk temperatures, because there really shouldn't be many surprises here compared to what we've already been tracking, but the numbers themselves are still genuinely worth walking through. If you live in the central or southern plains, brace yourself, because it's about to get seriously hot as we move into Sunday. We're looking at high temperatures approaching 115 degrees in central Kansas, with Kansas City coming in right around 100. Monday isn't going to bring any real relief either, with that same intense heat holding in place across essentially the same footprint. Meanwhile, if you happen to live over in the Great Lakes region, you're actually in for genuinely pleasant weather, precisely because of all the showers and thunderstorms we've been discussing throughout this forecast keeping temperatures suppressed, with highs in some spots only topping out in the upper 70s. That cold front we've been tracking should finally push across most of the Midwest by Tuesday and Wednesday, and that's going to cool things down noticeably, likely bringing low temperatures back down into the 40s and 50s as early as Thursday or Friday across parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which is genuinely great news if you're someone who's been ready for a break from summer heat. Otherwise, though, it's going to stay hot, especially across Texas and Oklahoma, right through the end of this week. I'm not seeing any meaningful relief on the horizon for that specific region, and there's essentially no rain in the forecast for most of Texas right now either, meaning that heat is likely going to keep building with nothing to interrupt it. So, pulling this entire forecast together into one clear picture, here's exactly what's changed and what to actually watch for over the coming week. Today, Saturday, carries a fairly limited, marginal severe threat across the northern and central plains into the upper Mississippi Valley, plus separate, smaller threats across the mid-Atlantic and Arizona, with most of the actual activity likely holding off until after dark. That's a genuinely quieter setup than what we were tracking heading into this weekend just a couple of days ago, which is really the first part of this storm's big turn. The bigger turn, though, is what happens starting Sunday, because instead of this system pushing cleanly through and clearing out, that frontal boundary is going to stall, and that's going to lock in a period of repeated thunderstorm development across essentially the same corridor, running from the upper Midwest through the Great Lakes and eventually into the Ohio Valley, all the way through Tuesday. Sunday specifically carries a genuinely high ceiling for organized severe weather, including a real tornado threat, given how much instability and shear are coming together across the upper Midwest. But layered right on top of that severe threat is a second, arguably more consequential hazard: flash flooding, driven by those same storms repeatedly training over the same towns and the same drainage basins as this front stays parked in place. Meanwhile, dangerous heat is going to keep building across the central and southern plains right through this same stretch, before that cold front finally arrives midweek and brings a genuinely sharp, almost autumn-like temperature drop to the upper Midwest by Thursday or Friday. Given everything we've just walked through, here's what's actually worth doing with this information, depending on where you live. If you're anywhere across the northern or central plains today, keep half an eye on the sky this evening and overnight, since today's activity is genuinely more likely to ramp up after dark than during the daytime hours. And make sure you have a reliable way to receive alerts overnight, rather than assuming you'll be awake to notice a warning yourself. If you're anywhere in the upper Midwest specifically, running from South Dakota through Minnesota, Wisconsin, and into the western Great Lakes, treat Sunday as a genuinely high-priority weather day, given both the real potential for a significant tornado threat and the uncertainty in exactly where the most dangerous storms end up setting up. Have a way to shelter quickly identified in advance, and don't make firm outdoor plans for Sunday afternoon and evening that would leave you far from safe shelter if a warning is issued. If you live anywhere in that broader corridor running from the upper Midwest through the Great Lakes and into Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania, expand your weather awareness beyond just the severe thunderstorm threat itself, and specifically watch for flash flood warnings running from Sunday through Tuesday, given the genuine risk of storms training repeatedly over the same ground and producing locally significant, potentially dangerous rainfall totals. And if you're anywhere across the central and southern plains, particularly Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, this remains a genuinely dangerous stretch of extreme heat with no real relief in sight for at least the next several days. So keep leaning on all the standard heat safety precautions, limiting outdoor exertion to the early morning, staying aggressively hydrated, and checking on anyone in your life without reliable access to air conditioning. Stepping back from the day-by-day specifics, here's the bigger picture takeaway worth carrying with you from today's update. This pattern has genuinely shifted since we last covered it, not necessarily towards something more dangerous overall, but towards something considerably more uncertain and considerably more drawn out. Instead of a single, cleaner, severe weather day passing through and clearing the pattern behind it, we're looking at a stalled frontal boundary that's going to keep recycling thunderstorm potential across roughly the same stretch of the country for the better part of a week, with the exact placement and intensity of any individual day's severe weather threat still genuinely uncertain, given how much this setup depends on smaller scale, harder to forecast mesoscale features, rather than a large, cleanly organized system. That's exactly why I want to keep checking in on this closely as we move through the weekend, because both the severe weather threat and the flash flooding risk building underneath it are likely to sharpen considerably in the forecast as we actually get closer to Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. We'll keep bringing you updates on this pattern as it continues to evolve, whether Sunday's tornado potential across the upper Midwest lives up to its current high ceiling, exactly how significant the flash flooding risk becomes across the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes as we move through early next week, and whether that midweek cold front manages to finally break the heat gripping the central and southern plains on the timeline current guidance is suggesting. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have that bell icon turned on so you're notified anytime we go live to track this in real time, because given how much uncertainty is genuinely baked into this specific setup, the picture could shift meaningfully with very little advance notice. Thank you all again so much for watching today's forecast, and we will see you in the next video or the next live stream.